Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. In today's webinar, we'll be talking about the what, why, and how of impact units. And we'll be learning more from our guest speaker, Tillman, about why Barry Callebaut has worked with SustainCERT and adopted impact units for their Scope 3 reporting and credible climate impact. My colleague Leah will share a few housekeeping notes in the chat, but we will proceed. My name is Elena Saputo. I am the head of value chain product at SustainCERT, and I will be your host and main presenter today. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Tillman Silber, who will be sharing his perspective on impact units and how Barry Callebaut has worked with them. Tillman, do you want to introduce yourself and Barry Callebaut for those on the call who are not familiar with the company?
Sure. Thank you, Elena, and also warm welcome from my side. Thanks for joining our webinar. So I'm Tillman. I'm with Barry Callebaut since a bit over 2 years, and I'm responsible for everything related to climate and forest with a special focus on our main crop, on cocoa. So tracking progress, setting strategies, and implementing improvements in our supply chain, most notably with our farmers. In case somebody does not know Barry Callebaut, we are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, cocoa and chocolate companies in the world. We are B2B, meaning we don't have own consumer brands, but we're delivering to our customers, which include all the big brands in the confectionery industry that we all know and love, but also smaller customers like, restaurants, hotels, etc. The segment that we call gourmet. And we are headquartered here in Zurich, Switzerland, where I'm also based, and working thus a lot with cocoa, working with dairy supply chains, sugar, etc. So all the different ingredients. We are vertically integrated, means our business really goes all the way from the farmer. So we have a lot of boots on the ground, visiting smallholder farmers all around the world, particularly in cocoa growing areas. Then all the way to our customers, so basically delivering semi-finished chocolate products to our customers, again, all around the world. Very glad to be here.
Thank you, Tillman. And then for those on the call who are not familiar with SustainCERT, if we could move to the next slide, I'll give you a brief introduction of what we do. So SustainCERT is an ISO accredited climate verification and certification company that's working to bring credibility to carbon markets and global supply chain decarbonization alike. It's our vision to support credible climate action, and we aim to achieve this by combining audit expertise with digital excellence to bring verification into the digital age. We believe that we can scale digital approaches to verification to help speed up and scale decarbonization globally, while also making it more accurate, transparent, and simple. In Scope 3, which is also known as the carbon emissions that occur in a company's value chain, both upstream and downstream, which is what we're talking about today, we offer both audit services, so validation and verification for Scope 3 reductions and removals, as well as the infrastructure to exchange these reductions and removals across and beyond your value chain, acting as the layer of credibility that can help scale collaboration and co-investment in supply chain action. SustainCERT also holds the secretariat function for the Value Change Initiative, which some of you on this webinar may be familiar with. It is a multi-stakeholder group that brings together civil society, some of the world's largest organizations and companies, and internationally recognized climate frameworks to identify best practices and ways forward for Scope 3 emission reductions and removals at scale. Now let's pause a second and talk about why are we talking about Scope 3. For many organizations, Scope 3 emissions account for by far the largest part of their total carbon footprint. It can go up to and beyond 70% of a total carbon footprint, depending on the sector. Now, we've seen globally that increasing regulation is pressuring companies to improve the disclosure of their emissions. And many companies, actually over 4,000 of them, have committed to the Science Based Targets Initiative, the leading authority on defining and promoting best practices in reducing emissions and setting net zero targets. However, what we're seeing is that with many companies setting these targets, they're finding out that while capturing and reporting emissions may be one thing, setting these targets may be one thing, taking active action to credibly reduce and achieve their targets is another. At SustainCERT, we wanted to understand better what the barriers to Scope 3 action were and how we could lead to those, or how we could learn from those organizations that are leading on what the barriers are exactly and what best practices are to help resolve these barriers. So we surveyed over 500 companies in both the US and Europe and asked them questions about their reporting or planned reporting on Scope 3 emissions, the key challenges that they saw or identified for reducing Scope 3 emissions, and how and what we need to do to scale credible climate actions, including their views on the role and importance of verification in doing so. Now, let's start with the good news. 92% of the companies that we spoke to are already or plan to report on their Scope 3 emissions in the next 12 months. 99% of that 92% have set an emission reduction or net zero target or are planning to do so soon. 9 in 10 of those reporting do obtain third-party verifications for Scope 3 emission reporting. Now, with that good news, we also saw that only half of the respondents said that they felt fully confident that their organization is really prepared for future regulatory changes related to Scope 3 emissions reporting. And that is in no small part due to the complexity that surrounds Scope 3 emission reductions. 39% of the organizations that we spoke to indicated that the biggest barrier to getting Scope 3 action accelerated was the greater investment priority given to Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission reduction projects. Getting clarity on what to do with Scope 3 emission reduction projects, therefore, sang a lower tune and was more difficult to get. This was partially caused by the other key challenges that we uncovered in speaking to them, which included things like limited control over suppliers and customers, the sheer complexity of measuring progress, the sometimes very high costs that are associated with carbon reduction and removal projects, the feeling of a lack of clear guidance on how and what to do, the perceived risk of double counting, double claiming, and free riding, and the challenge of identifying all relevant actors in the value chain and obtaining data from all of them. Now, we've invited Tillman here today to share more insights on Scope 3 reduction and the road to Scope 3 reduction from his perspective and the way that Barry Callebaut has dealt with it. Quite specifically, we'll explore the progress they've been making with their Scope 3 action through what we call interventions, and more importantly, why they have chosen impact units for the allocation and reporting of the outcomes of their verified intervention projects. Now, before I turn it over to Tillman, I want to take a second to pause and talk through 3 important concepts and definitions that we'll be repeating here for those of you that are new to Scope 3 reporting or emission reductions and removals. Now, the first is the idea or concept of Scope 3 emissions, which refers to all indirect emissions that are not included in Scope 2 that occur in the value chain of a reporting company, which includes both upstream and downstream emissions. The second is the concept of interventions. Interventions are projects, programs, and business decisions that can be used by companies to resolve some of the issues they face in Scope 3 decarbonization and achieve Scope 3 reduction. Interventions are aimed at directly reducing, or removing emissions in a company's greenhouse gas inventory. They provide a way of measuring changes in emissions to show year-on-year progress aligned to market-recognized practice. Thirdly, the concept of impact units. If impact units represent a verified Scope 3 intervention greenhouse gas outcome that can be, for the first time, appropriately allocated to companies seeking to claim or co-claim these in their Scope 3 reporting. One impact unit represents 1 ton of carbon reduced or removed by the intervention project it is associated with. Impact units were set up to mitigate the risks of free riding, double counting, and overclaiming, and enable companies to share cost of intervention across the supply chain, whilst also being recognized for the intervention, for the impact generated, which provides an additional incentive for corporates to collectively tackle Scope 3 emissions and scale climate action. SustainCERT has set up these impact units by working and using its LCA framework and proof of sourcing requirements to ensure that outcomes are not only appropriately allocated to companies seeking to claim, but that they're also claimed credibly. Impacts can be allocated across players and goods up and down the value chain. Now, Tillman, thanks again for joining us today and sharing your insights with us. Could you share with the people on the call Barry Callebaut's climate journey and your approach to Scope 3 emissions, and whether you identify or recognize some of the challenges that I shared earlier?
Right, thank you. So very briefly, when we talk about Forever Chocolate, just to say, we've been working on sustainability in a very structured manner since back in 2016, when we launched our Forever Chocolate strategy with a range of targets, including climate targets, but also deforestation, something on child labor and fighting poverty. And over the course of the start of this climate journey specifically, we reached quite a few actually kind of, I believe, world firsts that I'm quite proud about, even though I can't take credit because that happened prior to my time. But we not only launched and committed to SBTI back in 2019, but I think we were the first to come up with a very specific quantification of our deforestation impact. Right? You said before, Scope 3 is often 70% plus. For us, we're definitely in that category. It's more like 90% plus. The big part of that is coming from land use change. That means deforestation. So we were the first to launch a methodology and an approach to very specifically quantify what is called the direct land use change. So basically through satellite monitoring, polygon mapping, etc. I think also the world first, or at least one of the top 3 runners, we've been in achieving SustainCERT certification together with Gold Standard for our value chain interventions. That was back in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And ever since then, we have applied that. So for us, tackling Scope 3 is super important. Obviously, also Scope 1 and 2 are important, as you pointed out. But Scope 3 is really the big part, and we're working on that. On the intervention side, that means fighting deforestation, as I said, but also a lot of agroforestry. Agroforestry is at the heart of what we are verifying with the intervention certification scheme by SustainCERT, and we have been only ramping up our agroforestry approach since we first adopted it. There are also other activities, renewable energy, low carbon transport, feed additives, etc. But where we are working with SustainCERT since the early days, that's really on the origin of our raw materials, so all the way upstream. It's at farming level, right? And those are the areas where it's notoriously difficult to get good data, and SustainCERT is really helpful in that, and happy to unpack a little bit what it exactly means. Maybe just to mention, finally, we have just launched our sustainability report today. That was not set up. That's pure chance that this coincides timely. And you'll see there, for example, that last year alone, we have achieved 18,000 hectares of agroforestry, including a quite sophisticated model, including PES. And also there, for the first time, we announced that we have achieved, again, the SustainCERT verification for the last year. And only in the last year, we achieved over 230,000 tons of CO2. Might sound big, and I think it's quite big in the value chain space. For us, it means it's equivalent to about 3% of our footprint. So it's very important. It's very helpful, but obviously there's still a lot to do.
Thanks, Tillman. I'd like to dig into the intervention projects a little deeper in a second, but before we do that, can you share briefly your view on what makes accounting and reporting the implementation of action in your supply chain such a challenge for companies like Barry Callebaut and many others?
So I think it's mostly two things. It's data, and let's talk about this more if you want to. Probably let's do that. And then it's funding, and related to that, partly there's a bit the greenhouse gas standards, greenhouse gas protocol, which is not always in the current form, I think, covering all the or fitting, perfectly to all the challenges we have in today's supply chains, which are often not fully traceable, volatile, changing, etc. But it's really this mix of data and funding, where in both elements, SustainCERT is helping us. If you want to talk a bit more about the data, I think, I really said it's all the way upstream. And I mean, if you talk about all these upstream things, about agriculture specifically, for us, cocoa, right, but also dairy and sugar, as I mentioned, it's a huge data challenge. You can easily solve that for a first estimate by what is called a secondary data. That means you're working with a consultant, you're getting your kind of off-the-shelf averages for a certain country or even at global level. For example, what's the average emission of cocoa beans from Ivory Coast? You can get that easily. But in order to be able to track progress, often we need to, unpack that and need to go to what is called primary data. So we need to be able to have a higher granularity. And that is a huge, right? If you think about a company like us, we are relatively simple because we are doing mostly one thing, chocolate. And cocoa is so important if you compare then that, to only a cosmetics company, for example, which has a huge long tail of small ingredients, or even going further to companies which are using, like electronics, very highly processed materials. I think that shows a bit the magnitude of the data challenge that's ahead of us. And I think my most important thing there is, yes, it's important to start to move from those secondary data to primary data, but there is a potential risk in trying to hunt the best possible data for what is the current status. So what is essentially the baseline, right? So there is a risk that we're trying to unpack that exactly, and trying to fine-tune our models further and further, collect more and more data, which part is needed, but better data is not yet the end. We need to take climate action, and we need to do it urgently. And we cannot really afford to basically start to only collect data for 3-4 years. And so we need to be very careful about what kind of data we're looking for. We need to be sure that this data is actually, incentivizing action, and it's doing it in a way that wherever we are taking action and investing into interventions, for example, is also fairly allowing us to claim what we have done, because what gets measured gets done. So it's very important that if we're investing into improvements, we need to be able to claim it. And that's where SustainCERT is really helping us, because what it does is, particularly for us in agroforestry, it doesn't force us to basically say, okay, let's be clear about the as is in all detail. What it does, it focuses a lot on, what is the improvement? We have done an intervention, let's quantify together what the improvement is. That is kind of taking the best of what the carbon markets on offsetting, the criticism, and there many of that are sadly, have a true basis. So there's much improvement need on the carbon markets for sure on the offsetting side. But this principle of quantifying what is real improvement in a project versus what would have happened elsewhere, that's a very helpful thinking that SustainCERT, in my view, is bringing into the scope 3, and by this helping us to focus on what really matters, and that is the improvement part. Not necessarily are we now, to the last digit correct in what is the as is, it's the improvement. To make an example, so I said we're using this for agroforestry. That's the number one intervention right now. We might in the future expand the SustainCERT scope. Currently, it's agroforestry and cocoa globally. And what? Sorry, yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what we're doing is we're quantifying the removals from additional shade trees, right? And we're really asking, what have we done to improve the situation? We're not trying to say, okay, how much exactly are the cocoa trees currently removing? How much are maybe existing shade trees removing from the atmosphere? Because that's nothing that, that was already there. We're asking, and we're not quantifying necessarily that part. What we're quantifying is that we run a program. We bring in additional shade trees. We train farmers. We pay them even a payment for ecosystems or a financial incentive to look after the trees year on year so they keep growing. And then we quantify that delta. And that delta, in my view, often has a much lower error margin, and actually is the number that we should all be looking for, right? Rather than saying exactly what was before our intervention, did we have, how much did the existing shade trees, for example, remove? So I think that's a very a great approach that SustainCERT is helping us to work on.
Thank you, Tillman. And you already mostly answered my next question, which was, can you share for the people on the call that might not be as familiar with setting up projects, a little bit more detail of what exactly they represent, what do they do, and what does Barry Callebaut set out to achieve with them? So geographies, just repeating the intervention type, etc.
Yeah. So when we first started with SustainCERT's program, we had a bit of broader notion. We said, okay, let's do everything that we want to do, could possibly do in our supply chain. So we had agroforestry. We also had solar home systems, for example. We had cook stoves. We even were considering to take in kind of zero deforestation measures, which are, in my view, a bit harder to claim with SustainCERT, but we can talk about this. Over time, and that's also because the climate world has a bit changed, and our commitments have also changed. We're now focusing fully on Scope 3, and we found that both for this claim, Scope 3, the focus on Scope 3, which is aligned with net SBTi net zero. Whatever is outside our value chain is not aligned with it. So think, for example, cook stoves are for us not a part of Scope 3. So we are still doing it to a certain extent, but we're not really doing it from a climate perspective. So we have honed in on agroforestry because it's A, technically feasible, and B, helps us to really achieve our targets on net zero and SBTi. And this we are doing currently in most of our origin countries for cocoa, most notably Ivory Coast, Ghana, but also in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Indonesia, in Cameroon, to a certain extent in Nigeria. So there we work directly with the cooperatives and farmers that we're sourcing from. And I mentioned this briefly, we help them to understand the benefits of agroforestry. We provide them with seedlings of local species, which can be timber trees or can be fruit trees. So help them to understand how they should have to be planted and managed. And then, as I said, we also introduced the payment for ecosystem services, which I think is quite forward-looking and is trying to basically fairly incentivize and compensate the farmers for the work they're putting in the trees growing, planting, and growing over time. So we're paying year on year, depending on their survival rate that they achieve, a certain payment. That means, again, we go in and revisit the farms, we calculate the survival rate, and on that basis, we're then claiming removals and having them certified with SustainCERT. There's an annual audit process of this. And then at the end of the process, we're getting a basically broad statement for how much we achieved. I just mentioned last year, we had 230,000 tons of CO2 removals that we are getting then basically as a broad claim. And then the impact units help us to basically further transfer that.
And that leads into, it's a great segue into my next question, Tillman, thank you. So you're also the first you were one of the first to get verified for intervention projects and are now one of the first to issue impact units. Can you talk to me a little bit why impact units made sense for Barry Callebaut and what they enable you to do within Barry Callebaut and within your supply chain?
So we are a B2B company, meaning almost everything we're doing is jointly with our customers, right? The big brands, but also sometimes the smaller food brands, or even the what we call the gourmet customers, the hotels and restaurants. So we're really, to quite an extent, an enabler. And I just said we have in the past, without the impact units, we basically got a one document from SustainCERT year on year saying, last year you have achieved, X thousand tons of removals. We put that in our reporting. Now, again, what we need to do in order to scale this up is to be able to transfer and co-claim with our customers those removals. Co-claiming is great because, again, we're doing scope 3 removals. That means we have a full overlap in our inventory. If a big chocolate brand that is sourcing from us is basically together with us investing in our agroforestry project, we can both claim 100% of the benefit because that is part of our scope of both of our scope 3s, right? And that's super helpful. That means, but in order to make this scalable and implement this, and we need to be able to transfer in a credible way to our customers the claims. And of course, we can do this kind of when we're getting from what we have done, what in the past was, or to a certain extent, we've been doing it this way, basically to receive the report from you that said, we as a company have achieved X, and then we did our own math to fairly distribute this to our customers. Obviously, that's not the way, that's not the level of auditability and of professionalism that we need to really scale this up. What we need to do is find a reporting way from us to our customers, and possibly even from our customers to their customers, right, to the retailers. They're also part of the chain and can make similar claims. So a way to have this transfer done in a very credible way, that our customers know that whatever we are telling them is not double counting versus any other customer. And it also gives them in their reporting and for their own audits that they're going through a nice, report and proof that indeed they have, that they can show to really manifest the claim. Obviously, for this, certain checks and balances need to be in place. You talked about proof of purchase, right? We can dive into that if you want to. But it's, as I said, to wrap that up, it's absolutely instrumental in scaling up our offering towards our customers and making them benefit in their fair share, because they are, working with us on agroforestry. They're not as close to the farmers, so they're working with us to achieve this. But we need to then have that fair share. And that, in terms, I said in the beginning, two challenges: data and funding. And this is a great way to unlock funding. Obviously, it's not magically solving any funding challenges, but it's a good way to start to have an honest discussion about, in a way to enable that, an honest discussion about what is a fair funding and cost sharing between us and our customers look like. And then we both get the claim. So it's very, very instrumental for that.
Thanks, Tillman. We can go into proof of sourcing in a second if we have enough time, but I want to ask a question that I saw in the Q&A, and I'll urge all participants in this call to ask any questions that they have in the Q&A. We will reserve time for that at the end. But there's a question on how do impact units and carbon credits measure up to each other. Can you talk about, would you have been able to do the same with carbon credits as what you just described with impact units?
So basically, I think about it, but also Elena, feel free to comment. Right? I think about it that it is taking a lot of the carbon credits approach. It's kind of making the best of two worlds, from the offsetting side and from the supply chain side. So it's taking a lot of the rigor, the focus on improvement, from the carbon world, the focus on outcome, right? It's, for example, not about how many trees have been planted. It's about, make sure the tree is growing, because only then it absorbs CO2 and generates removal. So it's taking really some of the things that I think the carbon market has been really good at, but brings it together with the supply chain thinking, the fact that we need to focus on our own value chain. We need to start with decarbonization, right? And that is offsetting has not really honored that fact. So it allows basically only to make claims if the improvement that you've been working on is indeed in your scope 3. So it really takes in a lot of the good stuff from the carbon market and brings that to a net zero and SBTi logic. So it's really for me, the prototype of a market-based mechanism that is a great balance also between it's practical, it's doable today. We can, claim improvements of action. I said that's what we need, right? We need action and to be able to fairly claim improvements. We can start with that today, and while having a quite high level of scrutiny on what we do is, is solid and is real, and B, we are legitimate claimers of that because it's actually really in our value chain.
And thank you, Tillman. And, touching on that, I think, a final conversation would be, the supply shed concept and the proof of sourcing that is included in this approach towards interventions and impact units. Can you talk about how that enables a supply chain that is as complex as cocoa can be to achieve impact and share that? How do those two concepts help you?
Yeah. So proof of concept is the way to show traceability in chain of custody in a way, right? So what we are asked through this process is to prove that we are indeed sourcing from the farmer base that we're implementing the intervention. So there's an element between us and our supply base or supply shed. I'll come back to this. But also then for our customers, right? So it is in cocoa, but it has to be clear that our customers that aim to claim this also have to basically be part of this value chain. So we also need to show that indeed the customer making the claim is purchasing at least an equivalent amount of volume from us. So there is a match on that element as well. So we can really have the chain of custody, and we can make the proof that indeed it's in both ours and our customers' value chain. Possibly it could even be in our customers' customers, as I pointed out before. And this in a way which I think is practical today, right? We all know that the question of chain of custody is very tricky. So they're often in a complex supply chain like cocoa. Actually, if you're looking at palm or even IT, it's much more complex, I think, even. So in a way, we're kind of lucky. But in these contexts, it is not easy to ensure that every time there's a lot of mixing happening all across in different stages, right? You're basically pooling different volumes together, and then they're going to different factories on our side and the customer side. And I think the way the proof of purchase are currently set up, and together that with the supply shed approach, it's the right balance between allowing flexibility while holding companies really to account to act on where it matters most, and that is in their own value chain. So coming back to the topic of supply shed, because that helps, right? Basically in supply shed is a concept that I very much believe in, that it's needed in order to incentivize action. Basically, you're allowing for the traceability to be to not exactly to one specific farmer or cooperative, but to a bit a wider pool. What we're currently doing is country level supply shed. So for example, we would be saying a Ghanaian cocoa bean, well, we bring it down to that level. If you're making claims from Ghana cocoa, we are matching that with our volume sourced from Ghana. For most of that, there is really a physical, we're only doing agroforestry, we're doing mostly agroforestry with the farmers that we currently buy, right? But as I said, it's a volatile case, so we cannot guarantee that this farmer in 10 years, right, we have 20-year time horizon for agroforestry, we cannot guarantee and cannot force that farmer to still sell to us in 10 years. But through the supply shed model, we even have a certain protection to say, well, even if he's not physically delivering to us in 1 year, or actually entirely stops in 10 years and decides to sell to somebody else, through the supply shed approach, we can still maintain the claim as long as it's really us who are maintaining, monitoring, and monitoring the program over time. And that in terms that goes further to our customer, because obviously our customer even less has exactly proved that this bean comes from one customer, as many big customers are now asking to have this kind of segregation. This will take a while. So the physical link, this will take a while to implement. But it's also not just the big customers that we're working with, right? It's smaller ones. I think everybody needs an incentive. So supply sheds are very helpful.
Thanks, Tillman. Thank you so much for sharing these insights. The summary that I see of the points that we just discussed are why impact units? They enable the credible accounting of emissions reduced or removed by interventions in a company's supply chain. They enable the claiming of verified outcomes for the internal Scope 3 inventory. They enable companies to transfer claims to other supply chain partners and beyond, to other partners that source from the same supply shed, as you just said, Tillman. And they help amplify impact and accelerate credible value chain decarbonization. So I want to spend, before we go into the Q&A, and again, I would urge anyone that has questions that have not been answered to ask them in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and I'll get back to them in a few minutes. But I want to quickly recap on what we did with Barry Callebaut to help them scale credible climate action. So our value chain solutions allow companies to reliably and credibly achieve progress and report on Scope 3 reduction targets. For the first time, it also enables partners across value chains to co-invest in Scope 3 decarbonization and co-claim the impact of these outcomes. So we're fostering action and collaboration between supply chain actors. SustainCERT's work specifically with two sectors where this solution is most needed, which is apparel and textile and food and ag. In terms of the services that we provided, they stretched across four key pillars. The first being our audit expertise through validation and verification. So we looked at validating and verifying Scope 3 intervention projects. The second was enabling the impact management, claiming and reporting through our digital solutions, enabling companies to manage their intervention impact. Finally, we have our impact registry, which ensures against double counting and overclaiming and gives transparency and credibility to what has been achieved. Finally, our work with the Value Change Initiative, which is our pre-competitive stakeholder forum where we gather insights, best practices, helped enable Barry Callebaut and many others to work with SustainCERT to implement guidance, develop guidance, and implement successful intervention projects that were verified, validated, and verified. With the VCI, we have recently kicked off our fourth Food and Ag Working Group and look forward to kicking off another Apparel Working Group next year. So to conclude, I think it's clear that we need more ways to scale Scope 3 climate action. The research report that we conducted, the survey that we conducted, highlights that there's many barriers, but it's also clear that in a climate emergency situation, which we're in, we need to share more ways and innovation on how to create best practices, how to collaborate, and how to incentivize for the investment of time and funding in climate action. I, for one, am really grateful that we're working with businesses like Barry Callebaut and specialists like Tillman, who are truly pioneering ways to do this, enabling climate action. And we are delighted to see our innovation and services applied to supporting this positive action. I want to move now to opening it for questions. And I'll go into a question first, asking Tillman, have you already started to work with suppliers to talk about proof of sourcing and to share the impact units and the results from your intervention outcomes with them?
Suppliers are customers. I assume it's for us. It's mostly customers.
Yeah. Sorry.
And honestly, we are in the middle of this process. I was working basically yesterday on it with my team. So there is, yes, I said we have just launched today our overall report where it says what is our program level, our company level achievement on SustainCERT certified removals, 230,000. Now. What we're doing now is to really leverage the digital software, the platform that SustainCERT has in order to then say we are making a transfer really in that protected software environment, trusted and audited by SustainCERT, with the use of those proof of purchase. So yes, indeed. I think, again, we're pioneering here. So together with the SustainCERT team, we're trying to find the best proof points for proof of purchase. It's not necessarily always super easy, right? Because those are very complex business relationships, which have, if you then go into the detailed deliveries, right, there are hundreds or even thousands of deliveries in a year in a big relationship like that, that we often have. So we basically right now pulling the documentation together, and in order to make then the first real transfer. So this is happening right now. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you. Another question that I saw in the chat is asking what determined the focus on agroforestry versus other interventions. And I'll tie in another question into that, which is the question, what we're talking about and discussing today is a focus on carbon and carbon impact. And there's another question that asks, can this extend to biodiversity or potentially other impacts as well? What is your view on that? So how did you determine agroforestry as the material intervention to set up? And can the results of these projects be extended into other impacts beyond carbon in the future, or what is BC's aim there?
Yeah. Right. Okay. So we tried out different things, right? We looked at, I said, cook stoves. We looked at also a bit of biochar and other things. Well, we've been, and with a basically aim to then focus for the time being and really scale up what we felt worked best from a climate perspective, but also in terms of what is called co-benefits towards ecosystems. For example, bringing back and restoring biodiversity on farm and soil health through that, as well as farmer livelihoods, right? Providing additional income both through direct payments, PES, but also through alternative income sources. For example, the timber can be used as long as it's done sustainable over time. So it was really that notion of like, let's try out and then let's scale up what works best. And for us, it was agroforestry. We are looking into how we further scale this up and extend it. What I have to say also is that there is a synergy effect. So if we were now to include very different activities in our SustainCERT certification, let's think about maybe cover crops in sugar beet, for example. We we would have to really develop what is called a quantification approach quite a lot from scratch, because just quantifying the carbon removals from shade trees, additional shade trees in tropical cocoa smallholder setup versus in a Western European, for example, sugar beet context is very, very different thing. So the whole quantification approach we would have to redo, and that's a lot of investment just in the quantification part that we would have to do. It probably makes sense, but there's also this element of it's easiest to scale across the same intervention. And in terms of biodiversity and water, I believe it could be done, but I also think it will probably take a bit of time. So notoriously, biodiversity and water are not as easy to quantify as carbon is. So it's just more localized. When I think about water, 1 metric ton of a cubic meter of water is just very different if you're speaking about it in the Sahara versus in northern Sweden. So there's a big difference between abundance of water, and biodiversity is also not as straightforward. So I suspect, and then also on the target setting side, I think with SBTN, science-based targets for nature, there is a lot of drive in this field, but it's kind of at least 5 years late from SBTI, so delayed from it. SBTI has been launched together with Paris Agreement back in 2015. SBTN, I think, is basically now even maybe 6-7 years. They come up with the first guidances. So it will take a while, just because there's a time lag. But I really think that even once that time is done, the time lag, even then the quantification challenges of water and biodiversity will not be as big. So will be bigger as in carbon, meaning they have always a stronger qualitative element to it, which is hard to reflect in kind of these impact units. But yeah, that's my general thinking in this direction. But I still think, there will be more. We will talk more about quantification, and indeed, it could be applied, I think.
Thanks, Tillman. There's also a question on, how does the supply shed approach align with innovation that we see? So someone is saying obtaining reliable primary data from individual farms will become easier over time. Is there a risk that by focusing on supply sheds, there will be a gap when other solutions come to the market? And I assume the implication is here, getting perfect traceability and fully measured data. Is that a risk? And I know you and I have talked a lot about, we work with what we have and strive towards the future. So I do feel that Barry Callebaut looks at that as well.
I think they're much more complementary than that they are in contrast to each other, in conflict with each other. So a supply shed opens up, it doesn't replace primary data, but also keep in mind what I said in the beginning about it's important, we need to think about what are we doing with primary data, right? And I think we always need to think about improvement and think about that the end is improvement and it's not just purely data collection. But supply shed basically offers a way to work with today's realities in supply sheds, which are, again, they're intertwined, they're volatile. It might be that, as a farmer is leaving next year, or that, we know where we're sourcing from and we process all, but it might not be, it might not be feasible for our customer at the end of our chain to say exactly, this is the farmer that he's being delivered from, right? Because yes, those volumes are entering our system, but they're being mixed. In those elements, for those concepts and those realities in today's supply chains, that's where the supply shed approach offers a solution, and it's rather complementary to the primary data approach, I think.
Thank you. Then another question from someone who is familiar with the SustainCERT approach. They asked, how did you approach causality? How did BC prove causality in their projects?
Well, it's relatively straightforward, right? Because in our case that we're focusing on, let me take a step back. So causality, for the ones who are familiar to the carbon market, it is essentially the idea of additionality, right? That we're only claiming what we have actually improved. And I think that's, for me, a very important and a very helpful notion, because it really puts you in the question of like, what can you do? It rewards action. It doesn't reward trying to find who is the currently best supplier and source from, or farmer and source from that one, but it's really about what have you done? So how are we proving that? In our case, agroforestry, it's relatively straightforward, because we're providing the tree seedlings, and we're giving training, and for our new approach, which we're scaling up more and more, we are also providing even financial incentive. So it's very clear that we are the ones, and then we're only claiming, I said at the beginning, we're only claiming the carbon impact, the removals from those trees that we've planted. If there is a big forest, remnant forestry, which might be still removing CO2 from the atmosphere, but would have also without our action, we're not claiming that. We're focusing on the ones where we can show we have actually done a very significant part in incentivizing this. And then I said, and if there's underperformance to low survival, we correct for that, because we're monitoring survival very, very carefully.
Thanks, Tillman. There's also a few questions on SBTi flag and how impact units work with SBTi flag. Can you talk about how Barry Callebaut is approaching setting the flag target, and whether impact units are already playing into that or not?
No, absolutely. I mean, we are currently, we still have a SBT target without flag, but we're in the process of basically formalizing our SBTi flag submission, with a 2030 time horizon, and also net zero. So, and the impact units, the agroforestry claims, are for us a very important part, a very instrumental part. That's something that we can scale up, that makes sense from beyond climate perspective, etc. So yes, it's a very important part for us.
And then I'm just scrolling through, because there's a few very complex questions in here as well. There's a few questions that ask about the approaches to how do you set co-funding agreements, pricing, etc. Can you talk about what you've seen in the industry at large on any approaches to this for either Barry Callebaut or beyond?
Yeah, yeah. I'm not so sure we can talk about pricing with antitrust regulations.
No, it's more,
but
it's more the approaches that you see. So where, when, how?
I hear this question actually quite often, and people ask, "Oh, is there a rule as to how much?" Let's take the case us and a big chocolate brand. We went public with the big program we're doing with Nestle in Ivory Coast. We communicated about that earlier this year. So, and obviously that's a co-funding. I will not say how much co-funding. I cannot tell about the details, but I mean, there is no rule, right? This is in a way a commercial, if you will, agreement between the different companies engaged. So it's a negotiation piece. If you're asking me, I think if you're looking at the value chain of the benefits, so there is, again, we are co-claiming 100% of the benefits as long as we're making scope 3 claims, and that's what we're doing. In the end, if you're more closer to the consumer as a company, right, you'll probably be able to materialize, you pass on maybe some of the additional costs, you're able to materialize more marketing benefits, etc. from it. So that's something to keep in mind when we're talking about the contribution of the downstream player, of the B2C company. As an upstream, I think our benefit very much is that we're de-risking our supply chain. We are making sure that there's, the farmers are more resilient. Agroforestry can help to mitigate or adapt to climate change in the future. It can help to improve the situation of the farmers. So all of those are things which are addressing material risk to our supply. So that's a benefit to us. If my gut feeling, but I mean, I'm conflicted because I'm representing a B2B company, is typically that the downstream player is taking a bigger part, but it's very much up to negotiation between the different parties involved to find something that works for everybody involved, a fair share. I think it is very important to have this discussion. What is the fair share that we should invest?
Thanks, Tillman. In the interest of time, I'll ask you a final question. There are many other questions in the chat that we can review and get back to. Some of those are quite specific for SustainCERT as well. But I'm curious to hear, Tillman, what's next for Barry Callebaut on their Scope 3 journey. Can you talk me through what the future ambition is, what we should expect, and what you hope to do?
Right. So I think this is a very pivotal moment in our journey, because with the impact units, we are able to really systematize the way how we collaborate and co-claim with our customers, both big ones, but also, small ones. And I would be, I'm really working towards scaling that up and making sure that more and more companies are joining this journey and really, entering programs, supporting the programs or real action that we have now, and basically able to claim the benefits of that within a reasonably short time. We would like to see this evolve also to other ingredients. So for us, right, other ingredients outside cocoa are very relevant, dairy is very relevant, etc. There, normally we are not in a position to, at the same level, control the programs and the projects on the ground. Meaning here we're much more relying on what our suppliers are currently doing. I would love to see, but I know that brings certain questions and challenges to SustainCERT, to be able to use this approach of transferring impact units together with also other certification schemes, right? I might have a very mature supplier in dairy, for example, which has already done a lot of work and has a very credible way of proving that they are actually reducing emissions, and they want to share that with us and our customers, but they might not use SustainCERT certification. So is there a way to plug them in? Because I think in the end, it is a bit of a numbers game. The more use the approach, the better it is and the better it will be. And that could even develop into a kind of marketplace. Again, not like a global offsetting marketplace, but very specific one. So for example, one for, Ivorian improvements in Ivorian cocoa. And I think that would really, again, leverage some of the effectiveness of carbon markets, of offsetting markets, but bring it towards the, towards where it really matters most for us, which is in our value chain. So this will be, I think, for us, a very important one. Maybe the last point is I would love to see, I think, a complementary part to what SustainCERT is now doing with the impacts unit would be that basically at supply shed level, industries come together and align on kind of rules of the game. And I start to see this happening in certain markets. But I think this together is very, very powerful. So together, your scheme of kind of transferring a marketplace for impact units within the confinements of a supply chain and supply shed, together with an agreement of rules of the game to further make sure that I can be sure that what I'm claiming I have cost, but can I be 100% sure that my farmer in 10 years may be delivering to somebody else, and that other person is not asking the question, have I costed this or not, right? That's where an industry agreement on the rules of the game would very much help. And this together, I think, is for me the future of Scope 3 action that I would love to see grow.
I'm right there with you. Very exciting stuff. Thank you so much, Tillman, for being with us today, sharing your experience, sharing your knowledge with everybody on this webinar. It was amazing to hear, and we at SustainCERT continue to enjoy working with Barry Callebaut and many other front runners as well. For everybody, all participants, the recording and the presentation itself will be shared with all of you in a follow-up email. That email will also include an email address should you have any follow-up questions or want to set up any follow-up conversations. If you're interested in learning more about the findings of the Scope 3 research that we presented at the beginning of the call, my colleague Leah has shared the link to that report as well. Thank you again, all of you, and we look forward to speaking to you soon. And thank you, Tillman.
Thanks for having me, Elena. Thanks everybody for joining.